So, our shoeboxes are here and completed. We've already had a couple of rounds of applause, so I won't interrupt with more, but what an amazing achievement to have 121, 122, have I got the right number? So the shoeboxes this year, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about that and give us an opportunity to give thanks for all the work that's gone into that. So this year they're being sent by an organisation called Link to Hope, and I didn't know a lot about them before we started this journey, but if you don't know anything about them and would like to know more, I really recommend that you go and look them up. If you have access to the internet, go and find their website. There's a lot of information on there that's really interesting. And the thing I found notable was that their main purpose in doing what they do, and they do much more than sending shoeboxes, is to witness to their faith by their generosity. And there's some words from their website here. They said that the way the first Christians made converts was through the example of their generous lifestyle. The way they gave their money away, the way they welcomed strangers, the way they cared for widows and lepers, the way they rescued infants left to die in the fields. Their generous lifestyle, not their doctrine, not their music, not their facilities, is what convinced unbelievers that Christ must be raised from the dead. How about that for a challenge, hey? And thinking about the shoeboxes reminded me of some other examples of this kind of giving that we come across. So a few weeks ago, Chris and I took some of our old, unneeded clothes, mostly things the kids had grown out of and things that we didn't need anymore, to the cowshed. And if you haven't come across them, again, I really recommend you go and have a look. They're an organisation, and their sort of tagline is showing love and support to those in need in Berkshire. And they take referrals from people who don't have enough and aren't able to provide clothing and things for themselves and their families. And they take good quality used clothing, homewares, bedding, curtains, all that kind of thing, and give it to people who need it. And as we were taking our bags into them, and they're always very, very grateful, they take an incredible amount of stuff from across Berkshire, and they're always going through it. The number of referrals they must get must be massive. And we were just thinking, on one hand, this is such an amazing service. How great is it that there are all these people across the city, the places that we live, who are willing to donate their things to give to people in need. But on the flip side, this really shouldn't be necessary. We shouldn't need to do this. And there are so many other organisations doing similar work. And we've done an incredible job here putting together so many boxes that will bring a smile to families who are in great need. But it shouldn't be like this. We would all love the day to come when we don't need to do this because everyone has what they need. For now, though, we have to strike a balance between striving for a better, fairer world while also knowing that our job right now is to care for those who need us. And it's a difficult balance to have, and it's a difficult tension to hold, but we need to do that and look at what an amazing job we've done.
Reading from Habakkuk, chapter 1. This is the message that the Lord revealed to the prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk complains of injustice. O Lord, how long must I call for help before you listen, before you save us from violence? Why do you make me see such trouble? How can you endure to look on such wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are all round me, and there is fighting and quarrelling everywhere. The law is weak and useless, and justice is never done. Evil men get the better of the righteous, and so justice is preserved. And then from chapter 2, the Lord's answer to Habakkuk. I will climb my watchtower and wait to see what the Lord will tell me to say and what answer he will give to my complaint. The Lord gave me this answer. Write down clearly on clay tablets what I reveal to you, so that it can be read at a glance. Put it in writing, because it is not yet time for it to come true. But the time is coming quickly, and what I show you will come true. It may seem slow in coming, but wait for it. It will certainly take place, and it will not be delayed. And this is the message: those who are evil will not survive, but those who are righteous will live because they are faithful to God. Amen.
Our second reading this morning is from Luke 19, verses 1 to 10, and I'm reading from the Lyons Children's Bible. The Watcher from the Tree. Jesus and his disciples were on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Jesus knew it would be his last journey there. Other pilgrims joined them as they came near to the beautiful city of Jericho. All around was barren desert and the wasteland by the Dead Sea. There were no green things growing. But because of its fresh water springs, Jericho was green with sweet-smelling balsam trees and fruitful date palms. Tax collectors made a good living in that city, and none more than Zacchaeus, their chief. But he was not happy, although he was rich. Everyone despised and insulted him. They knew that he lined his pockets with their hard-earned money, as well as passing it on to the hated Roman rulers. Zacchaeus had heard about Jesus, the wonderful teacher who changed people's lives. How he wished he could see him. But the crowds had already lined the city street, and if he tried to squeeze through, he'd get nothing but kicks and sharp elbows. If he stayed where he was, at the back, he'd see nothing. He was too short. Zacchaeus glanced up at the fig tree and that grew beside the street, and he decided what to do. A few minutes later, as the little procession was arriving, he was surveying the scene below from the vantage point of a strong branch. Jesus and his followers came level with the tree, and Zacchaeus held his breath. Then Jesus stopped and said, looking up straight at Zacchaeus, "Come on down, Zacchaeus. I'm having dinner with you today." Zacchaeus came down a good deal faster than he had gone up. Brushing leaves and twigs from his stained robe, he went hesitantly forward. The unkind mutters of the crowd reached his ears. Why would Jesus go to dinner with him? Everyone knows he's a crook. But Jesus put his hand on Zacchaeus' shoulder, and together they went towards his fine home. No one knows what Jesus said over dinner, but when they both came out again, the waiting crowd could see that Zacchaeus was indeed a changed man. He stepped boldly forward and said, "Lord, I'm going to give half of all I have to help the poor. If there's anyone I've robbed," and his eyes went from one to one and another in the crowd, "well, I'll pay him back 4 times as much as I took." Jesus turned to the amazed crowd. "It's people like Zacchaeus I came to find," he said. "I came to look for those who have strayed away from God and bring them back to him." Amen.
Well, I have to say, that reading from Habakkuk felt a bit like it was written just for the days we're living in right now. And that was when I read it a couple of weeks ago with no idea what was still to come before I stood up here to preach about it. In the version I had, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you, violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law becomes slack, and justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous, therefore judgment comes forth perverted." Politics aside, it's not hard to see the parallels between Habakkuk's words and the world today. How much do we look around us and see trouble and destruction and feel like we're waiting and crying for help and hearing no answer? And the combination of this reading and the story of Zacchaeus made an interesting pair. Hearing them together, especially in the current climate, made me think a little bit differently about the Zacchaeus passage. But we'll come to that in a little while. If my technology was with me, there we go. So, a little bit about Habakkuk. This section that we heard gives us an insight into the prophet's concerns and complaints to God at God's apparent lack of action. And the whole book of Habakkuk actually is only short. It's only 3 chapters, and they're quite short chapters. And if you have the time, it's well worth reading the whole thing. It adds a bit of context to the section that we just heard and gives a bit more detail about the situation that Habakkuk was living with. And it's actually very different to a lot of the other prophetic books, where mostly we hear God challenging the people through the words of the prophets. But Habakkuk centres around the prophet confronting God, questioning God's actions or inaction, and asking, how is all this violence and evil allowed to go on? And the first 2 chapters are mostly Habakkuk railing against God and venting all his anger and frustration at what people are doing to each other. And he lays it all at God's feet and says, why? But even in that short extract that we heard, we still get a sense of that despair and anger at God for all this suffering and violence. With the state of the world he sees around him, that God seems to not even be responding. Do we find it odd, or maybe even a bit uncomfortable, to hear the prophet addressing God like this? But the Bible is full of similar passages, words of lament, as we call them, for the situations that people find themselves in, where they lay before God their feelings about all this pain and injustice and suffering. And it can be really helpful to hear passages like this when we're feeling a bit like that too, when it feels like we're living in a time of lament. And I don't know about you, but at the moment I often look around at the world and its people, the decisions we make and the things we value, and wonder how on earth will it get better. We've been through nearly 3 years now of COVID, which has destroyed so many lives and probably will never go away. Around the world, war and conflict continue to be a daily reality, with so many displaced people from Ukraine now, as well as Syria, Afghanistan, and more. People struggling to find a place of safety. We've brought our planet to the brink of almost irreversible climate change, and we're causing extinction of species at a frankly alarming rate. The effect of the cost of living crisis is starting to bite for many, affecting people's finances, but also quality of life and mental and physical well-being. Add to this the political turmoil of recent weeks and months, decisions made by our leaders that divide rather than unite, that increase the gap between rich and poor, and abandon plans to care for our planet in favour of all-important growth. It feels like this is a society which encourages people to look after themselves rather than looking after others. And regardless of our political leanings, it's not surprising that we might look around and worry about what the future might hold. I have to say I feel some sympathy with Habakkuk, a desire to lay all this before God and ask why? How is all this happening? And most importantly, when and how is it going to end? It's not easy. And we're allowed to feel frustrated, angry, helpless, lost, and even scared. And God is okay with us feeling like this too? The fact that there's so many similar passages like this recorded in the Bible tells us that God wants to allow space for lament. God honours our questions, and God doesn't want us to keep them hidden. And so we should give ourselves time to feel these things, to experience it and sit with it, and to sit with God while we do. Reading Habakkuk today might be a little bit like watching a sad film when you're already feeling down. It might not be a feel-good pick-me-up, but sometimes passages like this give us a means for expressing our emotions and the things we're struggling with. They can help us to see the real extent of the world's brokenness and remind us that we're allowed to feel this way. We're allowed to bring all our feelings to God. Our thanks and praise, yes, but also our anger and frustration and despair. So we move on. The story of Zacchaeus. It's probably much more familiar to most of us than the prophecy of Habakkuk. And when we know a story well, we often don't need to listen as carefully because we know what's coming. And thanks to Alice for reading it to us from a different version, that kind of threw up a few other ideas as well. But what's also true, and those of us who preach or lead worship know this very well, is that you can come to the same passage again and again and find something new. Because the meaning isn't just about what's written on the page, it's about your particular circumstances, recent events, and so much more. And in the same way, whatever message you think you're preaching from up here is filtered through the experiences and perspectives of those who are listening. So actually everyone will hear it in a different way. So this time, I came to the story of Zacchaeus after reading Habakkuk, with the backdrop of the government's mini-budget announcing tax cuts for the wealthy and tightening the rules for people claiming benefits. I have to say that feeling of lament was real. And so this story of Jesus' encounter with the unpopular tax collector, which I thought I knew, became different again. Now, it's not just the story of an individual and his experience of meeting with Jesus. Zacchaeus becomes an example of the impact of the system he's part of, the rule of the Roman Empire and the people being forced to pay taxes to Caesar, the wrongdoing and injustice that Habakkuk is condemning, the system which God should be coming to overthrow. This is the system which Zacchaeus finds himself caught up in, a system in which the balance of power and the sharing of wealth is broken. But as well as giving us space to feel our despair and loss, these passages also show us hope and good news. Hooray. Let's look again at the story of Zacchaeus. What does it have to tell us? And can we learn something new from it if we look at it with a different perspective? So the usual reading of the story goes like this. Zacchaeus was a tax collector, therefore he was a sinner. And people didn't expect Jesus to want to associate with him. Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house to prove them wrong and also to show Zacchaeus that he's still loved and deserves grace. And then, in response to this invitation, Zacchaeus repents of his wrongdoing and declares that he's going to repay everything 4 times over. The usual interpretation is that no one's beyond the reach of God's forgiveness, and that we shouldn't be as quick as those of Jesus' day to dismiss people who seem to be unworthy. There's 2 things I'd like to reflect on about this story, which might change the way we think about it. The first one is an interesting quirk of the different ways the story's been translated. Or at least, I thought it was interesting. You might think I'm splitting hairs, in which case feel free to have your own reflections for a minute or 2. But one way to get a fresh perspective on a well-known story is to look at it in a different translation and see what's the same and what's changed. It's not saying that any version is right or wrong, but it can help us engage with the story in a different way. In the case of this story, some translations, I found, have a slightly different version of Zacchaeus' response to Jesus, and that changes the context of the conversation they have. So, as I said already, the way we're used to it, Zacchaeus promises to change his ways, and that happens as a result of his encounter with Jesus. In the Good News version, it goes like this. I will give half my belongings to the poor, and if I've cheated anyone, I will pay back 4 times as much. But when I looked at this in some other versions, like in the Revised English Bible and in the NIV, we see a different picture. Look, Lord, here and now, I give half my possessions to the poor. And in some other versions, he goes on to say, if I've wrongfully exacted something from anyone, I restore it 4-fold. Here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've wrongfully exacted something from anyone, I restore it 4-fold. In this version, instead of Zacchaeus having a sudden change of heart and promising to do better, he's telling Jesus that this is already what he's doing. Jesus has invited himself to Zacchaeus' house, and the crowd complains he's gone to visit a sinner, which they've assumed because of his job. But Zacchaeus responds by protesting against this and saying they've got it wrong, and explaining to Jesus that even though he is a tax collector, he's doing his best to make it right. It's not an instant response, but an already instinctive attitude of giving to those in need and attempting to make things right if he makes a mistake. In this version, the impact of the encounter with Jesus isn't a sudden change in Zacchaeus, but to show the crowd that they were wrong about him, to highlight their prejudice in assuming he was a cheat because of his job. Now, we can't say that that one particular version is more accurate than any other. And Alice's version gives us a different slant on it again. But it does give us a different way of thinking about Zacchaeus, which brings me to the second thing I wanted to think about with this story. Whether or not Zacchaeus was already living this way, or whether this was a massive conversion, we know he was a tax collector and we know he was rich. We also know the crowd had already dismissed him as a sinner because of this. He was seen as unacceptable by the community. Because of the job he did, he was on the outside. He was excluded. We know that Jesus came to welcome the outsider, to stand with the marginalized, and that we're called to do the same. We often have a very fixed idea of who the marginalized are, usually those who we can sympathize with. Possibly people who are victims of circumstances, perhaps, but still people who are on our side, for want of a better phrase. But what about those whose behaviours or politics makes them seem like our opponents? Those who seem to be complicit in injustice and wrongdoing? The people that Habakkuk was railing against, the tax collectors like Zacchaeus, those who perpetrate injustice in our world today. Zacchaeus' story tells us that Jesus is reaching out to these people too. Zacchaeus was marginalized because of his own choices, but still Jesus doesn't stand with the crowd and dismiss him. Just as Jesus always does, he turns all our expectations and societal norms upside down and brings Zacchaeus from the margins into the center. This man too is a son of Abraham. We're quite comfortable with the idea that Jesus stands with the victims, the oppressed. But here we see that he also reaches across that divide to the oppressor in the same way. This is real, radical inclusion. And it's really challenging. But there's also cause for hope. At a time when differences of nationality, religion, politics, and so much more threaten to cause division and distrust in our society, we can see that God is championing real inclusion across these boundaries. And, as you might expect, God is asking us to take part. So, we're back to the beginning again. What can we do? How can we even begin to address some of these big issues on our own? How am I, as one person, going to make a difference to the needs of God's world? When it all feels too much, and we can't see things improving, and in lament we share all our despair and our troubles with God, what does God say? Just as Jesus reached out to Zacchaeus, to those on the margins, and just as God promised to Habakkuk, there is still a vision for the appointed time. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. Even if we don't think we can see it, God is at work in the world, now and always. But, and there's always a but, we also need to remember that we are part of the way that God is working in the world. We don't get to just throw all our grumps and complaints out there at God and wait for God to sort it out. We have a part to play too. We're called to follow Jesus' example of radical inclusion, not just the inclusion that we like to own, but real inclusion. We talk about being inclusive, and our church mission statement proclaims that we are here actively sharing and celebrating God's unconditional love. I don't think we'd argue with that. And as Helen was saying here the other week, probably most churches would profess to being inclusive and welcoming of all. But how much are we still putting limits on that? This week, I want us to think about who are the Zacchaeuses in our community, in our lives, who we could and should be extending God's love and grace to. And what would that look like? And I'm fairly sure we'll need to ask for God's help in meeting that challenge. Second thing we can do, we're called to be change makers, not just accept the status quo, but just like Habakkuk, to call out injustice and wrongdoing and to do something about it. And as much as this isn't and shouldn't be a political speech, I really, really do believe that the single biggest thing that any of us can do to affect change for our country and the world is to influence how our country is run by using our right to vote. And I'm not talking about who you vote for, I'm talking about doing it. Don't give in to the temptation to believe that your vote doesn't count or that they're all the same so it doesn't matter. Challenge yourself here and now to do some reading, to talk to friends and family, listen to the messages being presented and vote thoughtfully, prayerfully, considering what's in the best interests of the poor and the oppressed, the best interests of the planet, even if, and perhaps especially if, they're counter to your own. Go and have a look at the Methodist Covenant Prayer and see what it says about counter to your own interests. And the third thing is right back where we started with the shoeboxes. The world shouldn't be dependent on donations like this to make sure people have the basic necessities of life or to enable families to receive a gift at Christmas. There shouldn't be people in our own neighbourhood who are unable to feed or clothe themselves and their families. And we should every day be doing everything we can to bring about change and a fairer distribution of the world's resources. But until then, we're still called to share what we have with those who have less. The Link to Hope website quotes their motivation as Jesus' message about how his disciples should treat others. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. We live in an imperfect world. There is pain and hunger and need all around us. It's okay to bring our concerns to God, to declare to God how it makes us feel, and to ask for help. And God says to us, there is a vision for the appointed time. It will surely come. As followers of Christ, we're called to do all we can to meet the needs of our neighbour, while also working towards building a better world which reflects the love and grace of our Creator. Amen.